In the heart of revolutionary Paris, on a sweltering July day in 1794, a man who once wielded the power of life and death over thousands faced the very instrument of terror he had championed. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror, stood before the guillotine, his face pale and bandaged from a desperate act of defiance or despair, as a bloodthirsty crowd roared for his end. The blade that had claimed countless lives under his command now loomed as his own executioner, a poetic and brutal irony that would echo through history. This is the story of a man who rose to become the voice of the French Revolution, only to be devoured by the very monster he created. It is a tale of idealism turned to tyranny, of power corrupted, and of a death as dramatic and horrifying as the era he defined. To understand Robespierre's fall, we must first step back to the turbulent years of the late 18th century, when France was a cauldron of unrest, inequality, and rage. The year was 1789, and the ancient regime of King Louis XVI was crumbling under the weight of economic collapse, famine, and the growing cries for liberty and equality. The monarchy, bloated with privilege, had long ignored the suffering of the peasantry and the burgeoning middle class, who bore the burden of taxes while the aristocracy feasted in opulence at Versailles. The Enlightenment had ignited minds with ideas of democracy and human rights, and the American Revolution across the Atlantic had proven that a people could overthrow tyranny. In France, the storm was brewing, and it would soon erupt with a ferocity that no one could have predicted. Maximilien Robespierre, born in 1758 in Arras, a small town in northern France, was not a man of wealth or noble blood, but of intellect and unrelenting conviction. A lawyer by training, he was a slight, unassuming figure with a pale complexion and a quiet demeanor, often dressed in meticulous, old-fashioned clothing that earned him the nickname the Incorruptible. Yet beneath this reserved exterior burned a fierce belief in the ideals of Rousseau and the Enlightenment equality, virtue, and the will of the people. As a young man, he had witnessed the injustices of the feudal system firsthand. His own family struggled after his father abandoned them, leaving Robespierre to be raised by relatives. This early hardship forged in him a deep empathy for the downtrodden, but also a rigid moralism that would later harden into something far more dangerous. By the time the Estates General convened in 1789, a desperate attempt by the king to address the nation's crises, Robespierre had already begun to make a name for himself as a defender of the common man. Elected as a representative of the Third Estate, the voice of the masses, the French Revolution exploded that summer with the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789. A symbol of royal oppression reduced to rubble by an enraged populace. What began as a call for reform quickly spiraled into a radical upheaval as the old order was dismantled piece by piece. The monarchy was stripped of absolute power, feudal privileges were abolished, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed a new vision for society. Robespierre, now a prominent member of the Jacobin Club, a radical political group advocating for democratic reforms, merged as a leading voice in the National Assembly. His speeches were not fiery or charismatic in the way of his rival, Georges Danton, but they were precise, logical, and imbued with a moral certainty that captivated listeners. He argued passionately for universal suffrage, the abolition of slavery in French colonies, and the redistribution of wealth, earning both admiration and suspicion from his peers. Yet, as the revolution progressed, the fractures within its ranks began to show. Moderates clashed with radicals, and external threats loomed as neighboring monarchies, fearing the spread of revolution, declared war on France. By 1792, the revolution had taken a darker turn. King Louis XVI, seen as a traitor for attempting to flee the country, was deposed, and France was declared a republic. The nation was now at war with Austria and Prussia, and internal dissent threatened to tear it apart. Paranoia gripped Paris as rumors of counter-revolutionary plots spread like wildfire. It was in this atmosphere of fear and chaos that Robespierre's vision of virtue began to twist into something more sinister. He believed that the revolution could only survive if it purged itself of enemies real or imagined. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible, he would later declare, laying the ideological groundwork for what would become the Reign of Terror. The guillotine, a device originally intended as a humane method of execution, was about to become the symbol of his unyielding crusade. As the Committee of Public Safety, a powerful governing body, was formed to steer France through crisis, Robespierre's influence grew. He was not yet the dictator history remembers, but the seeds of his tyranny were sown in these early years of bloodshed and betrayal. The stage was set for a descent into darkness, as Robespierre and his allies sought to remake France in the image of their ideals, no matter the cost. The revolution, once a beacon of hope, was becoming a machine of death, and the man at its heart would soon learn that even the most incorruptible could fall. In the coming parts, we will trace the rise of the Reign of Terror, the betrayals that turned allies into enemies, and the brutal, inevitable end that awaited Robespierre on that fateful summer day. As the French Revolution barreled into 1793, the air in Paris was thick with suspicion, desperation, and the metallic tang of blood. The Republic, newly forged from the ashes of monarchy, was under siege from without and within. Foreign armies marched on French soil, determined to crush the revolutionary experiment, while internal factions tore at the fragile unity of the nation. The Girondins, a moderate faction favoring a more cautious approach, clashed bitterly with the radical Jacobins, who demanded swift and uncompromising action to protect the revolution. At the heart of this maelstrom stood Maximilien Robespierre, his once idealistic vision hardening into a relentless drive for control. The man who had spoken so passionately of liberty and equality was now becoming the chief architect of a regime that would drown France in terror. The turning point came early in 1793, when King Louis XVI, stripped of power and dignity, was dragged before the National Convention to face trial for treason. Robespierre, now a dominant voice among the Jacobins, argued fiercely for the king's execution. To him, sparing Louis was not mercy but weakness, a betrayal of the revolution's principles. Louis must die so that the nation may live, he declared with chilling conviction, his words cutting through the assembly like a blade. His rhetoric swayed the vote, and on the 21st of January, 1793, the king met his end beneath the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, his blood staining the cobblestones as a stunned crowd looked on. The execution sent shockwaves through Europe, enraging monarchies and intensifying the wars against France, but it also marked a dangerous shift within the Republic. The death of the king was not just the end of a man, but the beginning of a precedent. No one, no matter their status, was beyond the reach of revolutionary justice. With the monarchy gone, the revolution's enemies multiplied, both real and perceived. Counter-revolutionary uprisings flared in the Vendée region, where royalist peasants and clergy resisted the Republic's anti-Catholic policies with ferocious guerrilla warfare. Abroad, the coalition of Austria, Prussia, and Britain tightened its grip, threatening to invade and restore the old order. Inside Paris, whispers of betrayal echoed through the streets. Nobles, priests, and even ordinary citizens were accused of plotting against the state. Robespierre and his allies on the Committee of Public Safety, a body granted near-dictatorial powers to manage the crisis, saw enemies everywhere. The committee, formed in April 1793, became the nerve center of the revolution, and Robespierre, though not its official leader, wielded immense influence through his moral authority and unyielding rhetoric. It was here that the Reign of Terror truly took shape, a policy of systematic violence designed to purge France of dissent and secure the revolution's survival. The guillotine, once a symbol of egalitarian justice, its swift, mechanical death, meant to be more humane than the torturous executions of the ancient regime, became the grim instrument of Robespierre's vision. Under the law of suspects, passed in September 1793, anyone could be arrested on the flimsiest of accusations, a whispered complaint, a past association with nobility, or even a lack of revolutionary zeal. Tribunals operated with ruthless efficiency, often dispensing with evidence or defense in favor of quick convictions. The accused were paraded through Paris in tumbrils, their hands bound, as jeering crowds lined the streets to witness their doom. Day after day, the blade fell, claiming thousands of lives aristocrats, clergy, and commoners alike. The Place de la Révolution became a theater of death, its scaffolds slick with blood, while the severed heads were held aloft for the crowd's grim approval. Robespierre justified this carnage as a necessary evil, a means to achieve a virtuous republic. Terror is an emanation of virtue, he proclaimed, believing that fear would forge unity and cleanse the nation of corruption. Yet, as the body count rose, so too did the fractures among the revolutionaries themselves. Robespierre's uncompromising stance alienated even his closest allies. Georges Danton, a towering figure of the early revolution with a booming voice and a pragmatic streak, began to question the endless bloodshed. Danton, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Robespierre on the committee, now called for moderation, for an end to the terror and a focus on rebuilding France. His faction, the Indulgents, argued that the revolution had achieved its goals and that further violence would only breed resentment. On the other extreme, the Hébertistes, led by the fiery journalist Jacques Hébert, demanded even harsher measures, pushing for the complete destruction of religion and the aristocracy with a fervor that bordered on anarchy. Robespierre found himself caught between these two poles, distrusted by both for his refusal to bend. To him, Danton's moderation was cowardice, a betrayal of the cause, while Hébert's extremism threatened to plunge France into chaos. In his mind, only he held the true path to virtue, and anyone who deviated was an enemy of the people. The tension reached a boiling point in early 1794, as Robespierre moved to eliminate his rivals with the same cold precision he applied to counter-revolutionaries. First, he turned on the Hébertists, accusing them of conspiring to overthrow the government. Hébert and his followers were arrested, tried, and guillotined in March 1794, their radical dreams snuffed out in a matter of days. Next came Danton, a far more personal and painful betrayal. Robespierre, though once a friend to the charismatic leader, now saw him as a corrupt opportunist, a man whose calls for mercy undermined the revolution's purity. Despite Danton's impassioned defense, "I am Danton, no weakling. I have served the Republic." He and his allies were condemned in a sham trial and executed on the 5th of April, 1794. As Danton's head rolled into the basket, Robespierre's power seemed absolute, but the cost was steep. He had silenced dissent, but in doing so, he had sown the seeds of his own destruction. Allies turned to enemies, and whispers of discontent grew louder among the convention and the committee itself. The man who had once been hailed as the incorruptible was now feared as a tyrant, his hands stained with the blood of friends and foes alike. The reign of terror was at its zenith, but Robespierre's grip on power was more fragile than ever. The very system he had built to protect the revolution was beginning to turn against him, as paranoia and betrayal festered in the shadows of Paris. In the next part, we will delve into the final months of his rule, as his enemies closed in and his own actions led to a dramatic and inevitable downfall. By the spring of 1794, Maximilien Robespierre stood at the pinnacle of power in revolutionary France, yet the ground beneath him was crumbling. The reign of terror, which he had championed as the ultimate safeguard of the Republic, had turned Paris into a city of ghosts, where the shadow of the guillotine loomed over every street and whispered conversation. Over 17,000 people had been executed across France since the terror's inception, with thousands more languishing in prisons, awaiting their turn on the scaffold. The Committee of Public Safety, under Robespierre's influence, ruled with an iron fist, but the cost of such unrelenting violence was becoming impossible to ignore. The French people, once inspired by the promise of liberty, now lived in constant fear, and even Robespierre's allies began to question whether the cure for counter-revolution had become a disease worse than the ailment itself. Robespierre's personal demeanor during these months reflected the strain of his position. Always a man of austere habits, he grew increasingly isolated, retreating into a small apartment on the Rue Saint-Honoré, surrounded by a dwindling circle of loyalists. His health, never robust, deteriorated under the weight of sleepless nights and relentless stress. Contemporaries noted his pallor, his trembling hands, and the feverish intensity in his eyes. He rarely appeared in public without his meticulously powdered wig and outdated green coat, as if clinging to an image of incorruptibility even as his actions painted a darker picture. His speeches, once precise and measured, became more erratic, filled with vague accusations against unseen enemies. He spoke of a grand conspiracy threatening the revolution, a shadowy cabal that only he could unmask. But to many in the National Convention, these rants sounded less like vigilance and more like paranoia. The man who had once inspired with ideals of virtue now seemed consumed by an obsession with purity that bordered on madness. The turning point came with Robespierre's push for even greater control over the revolutionary apparatus. In June 1794, he orchestrated the passage of the Law of 22 Prairial, a decree that stripped away the last vestiges of legal protection for the accused. Under this law, the Revolutionary Tribunal could convict based on mere suspicion, with no need for evidence or witnesses, and the only possible sentences were acquittal or death. The guillotine's pace quickened to a horrifying rhythm, claiming up to 50 lives a day in Paris alone during what became known as the Great Terror. The bloodshed was no longer limited to aristocrats or royalists. It ensnared anyone who dared to question the committee's authority, including former revolutionaries and even members of the convention itself. This indiscriminate slaughter eroded what little goodwill Robespierre had left. Deputies in the convention, fearing for their own necks, began to whisper of resistance. Men like Joseph Fouché, a cunning and ruthless politician who had once supported the terror, and Jean-Lambert Tallien, a former Jacobin with blood on his own hands, started to plot in secret, sensing that Robespierre's zeal was leading them all to ruin. Compounding the internal dissent was the shifting tide of the war. By mid-1794, French armies, under brilliant generals like Napoleon Bonaparte, were achieving stunning victories against the coalition of foreign powers. The Battle of Fleurus in June 1794 secured the Netherlands for France, a triumph that bolstered national pride but also undermined Robespierre's justification for the terror. With external threats receding, many argued that the emergency measures of the committee were no longer necessary. Why continue the bloodshed when the Republic was no longer on the brink of collapse? Robespierre, however, refused to relent. He insisted that internal enemistrators and conspirators remained the greatest danger, and he doubled down on his purges, alienating even his staunchest supporters on the Committee of Public Safety. Men like Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, his closest ally and a fellow ideologue, stood by him, but others, like Lazare Carnot, who oversaw military affairs, grew weary of his intransigence. The committee, once a united front, was fracturing under the weight of fear and ambition. Robespierre's final misstep came in late July 1794, when he delivered a fateful speech to the convention on the 26th of that month, known as 8 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar. Rising to the podium, His voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. He warned of a vast conspiracy within the government itself, implicating unnamed members of the convention and the committee. He refused to provide specifics, instead casting a wide net of suspicion that left every deputy wondering if they were the next target. "I have enemies," he declared, "and I will unmask them, even if it costs me my life." The speech was meant to rally support, to reassert his dominance, but it had the opposite effect. It galvanized his opponents, who now saw a clear choice: strike first or be struck down. Fouché, Tallien, and others, including Paul Barras, a corrupt but influential figure, moved quickly to organize a coalition against him. They spread rumors that Robespierre intended to declare himself dictator, a charge that, while exaggerated, resonated with a convention already terrified of his power. That night, as Robespierre returned to his modest lodgings, unaware of the storm gathering against him, plans were set in motion for his arrest. The once invincible incorruptible had overplayed his hand, turning allies into enemies and fear into rebellion. On the morning of 9 Thermidor, the 27th of July, 1794, the convention would become a battleground, not of ideas, but of survival. Robespierre's decline was complete. He was no longer the master of terror, but its next victim, caught in a web of his own making. In the coming part, we will witness the dramatic confrontation that sealed his fate, as the revolution turned on its most fervent defender with a ferocity that matched the guillotine's blade. The morning of 9 Thermidor, or the 27th of July, 1794, dawned over Paris with a stifling heat that seemed to mirror the tension gripping the city. Inside the hall of the National Convention, the air was electric with fear and anticipation as deputies gathered, their whispers buzzing like a swarm of angry hornets. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who had once commanded this very assembly with his unyielding vision of revolutionary virtue, was now the target of a desperate conspiracy. His speech the previous day, filled with vague accusations and ominous warnings of betrayal, had been the final straw for many. Men like Joseph Fouché, Jean-Lambert Tallien, and Paul Barras, who had once stood by or feared him, were now united in a single purpose: to bring down the incorruptible before he could bring them down. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end the reign of terror and Robespierre's life. As the session began, Robespierre took his place among the deputies, his pale face set with determination, unaware of the trap closing around him. He was accompanied by a small cadre of loyalists, including Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, his closest ally, and Augustin Robespierre, his younger brother. But their numbers were dwarfed by the growing coalition of enemies, who had spent the night rallying support and securing the loyalty of key figures, including the convention's president, Jean-Marie Collot d'Herbois, a former ally turned adversary. The plan was simple but ruthless: denounce Robespierre as a tyrant, declare him an outlaw, and arrest him before he could rally his supporters. When Tallien rose to speak, his voice cut through the murmurs with a boldness that stunned the hall. "I demand the arrest of Robespierre," he shouted, accusing him of aspiring to dictatorship and betraying the revolution's ideals. The words were a spark in a powder keg. Cries of agreement erupted, drowning out the protests of Robespierre's dwindling faction. Robespierre, caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack, leapt to his feet to defend himself, but as he opened his mouth to speak, chaos descended. Deputies shouted over him, refusing to let him reclaim the narrative as he had so many times before. "Down with the tyrant!" they roared, their voices a cacophony of rage and fear. Saint-Just attempted to intervene, his youthful fervor undimmed, but he too was silenced by the mob. In a moment of surreal desperation, Robespierre turned to the galleries, where the public often watched proceedings, pleading for the people, his people, to hear him. "For the last time, I ask to speak," he cried, his voice hoarse and breaking. But the convention had turned against him irrevocably. A motion was passed declaring him and his allies outlaws, a status that stripped them of all legal protection and marked them for immediate arrest. Soldiers of the National Guard, loyal to the conspirators, moved in to seize them, and Robespierre, along with Saint-Just, Augustin, and a handful of others, were dragged from the hall in disgrace. The arrested men were taken to different locations in a bid to prevent any coordinated resistance. Robespierre was initially held at the Luxembourg Palace, but as night fell, he was moved to the Hôtel de Ville, the seat of the Paris Commune, a body still sympathetic to his cause. There, in the early hours of 10 Thermidor, a glimmer of hope emerged as loyalists within the Commune and sections of the National Guard rallied to free him. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Robespierre might yet turn the tide. Armed supporters gathered, and plans were made for a counter-coup to restore his power. But the conspirators in the convention acted swiftly, declaring martial law and mobilizing their own forces under Barras's command. As the two sides prepared for a violent clash, Robespierre, exhausted and broken, hesitated. He refused to call for open rebellion, perhaps sensing the futility or fearing the bloodshed it would unleash. His indecision proved fatal. By the time Barras's troops stormed the Hôtel de Ville, resistance had crumbled. What happened next remains shrouded in debate, but the outcome was undeniable. As the soldiers burst into the room where Robespierre and his allies were holed up, chaos erupted. Some accounts claim Robespierre attempted suicide, drawing a pistol and firing at himself in a final act of defiance, only to shatter his jaw instead of ending his life. Others insist he was shot by a soldier in the scuffle, the wound a deliberate act to incapacitate rather than kill. Whatever the truth, when the dust settled, Robespierre lay on the floor, blood streaming from his mangled face, his once impeccable appearance reduced to a grotesque ruin. Saint-Just, stoic to the end, surrendered without a fight, while Augustin, in a desperate bid to escape, leapt from a window, breaking his legs in the fall. The leaders of the terror were now prisoners, their power shattered in a single brutal night. By morning, Robespierre was barely conscious, his jaw bound with a crude bandage as he was carted back to the convention for a final reckoning. The deputies, many of whom had trembled under his gaze just days before, now jeered and mocked him, reveling in the fall of the man who had held their lives in his hands. There would be no trial, no defense. As an outlaw, Robespierre was condemned to death without formality. The guillotine, the very instrument he had wielded to purge France of its enemies, awaited him in the Place de la Révolution. His end was near, and it would be as merciless and public as the thousands of executions he had overseen. In the next part, we will witness the harrowing final moments of his life and the brutal spectacle of his execution, a fitting, if tragic, close to the era of terror he had created. The morning of 10 Thermidor, or the 28th of July, 1794, broke over Paris with a cruel, unrelenting sun, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to the end of an era. Maximilien Robespierre, once the unassailable architect of the reign of terror, was now a broken man, his face a mask of blood and agony from the gunshot wound that had shattered his jaw the night before. A crude bandage, soaked crimson, wrapped his head, and his eyes, once sharp with moral certainty, were dulled by pain and defeat. After the chaotic confrontation at the Hôtel de Ville, he and his closest allies, Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, Augustin Robespierre, and others had been recaptured by the forces of the National Convention. There would be no reprieve, no final speech to sway the masses. As outlaws, they were denied even the pretense of a trial. The guillotine, that merciless machine of revolutionary justice Robespierre had so fervently endorsed, awaited them in the Place de la Révolution, ready to claim its most infamous champion. The journey to the scaffold was a public humiliation, a stark reversal of the power Robespierre had wielded for so long. Bound and barely able to stand, he was loaded into a tumbril, the same rough cart that had carried thousands to their deaths under his orders. Alongside him sat Saint Just, his expression stoic and unyielding even in defeat, and Augustin, crippled from his desperate leap during the night's chaos. The streets of Paris, once echoing with cries of support for the incorruptible, now rang with jeers and insults as a massive crowd gathered to witness his downfall. Men and women who had lived in terror of his decrees spat and shouted, their fear transformed into vengeful glee. "Tyrant! Murderer!" they cried, hurling abuse at the man who had sent so many of their kin to the blade. Robespierre, weakened and dazed, could offer no response. His shattered jaw rendered him mute, a final irony for a man whose words had once shaped a nation's destiny. The procession moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring the spectacle of his disgrace was seared into the memory of all who watched. When the cart reached the Place de la Révolution, the heart of the Terror's bloody theater, the guillotine loomed like a grim sentinel against the summer sky. The scaffold was stained dark with the blood of countless victims, a testament to the violence Robespierre had unleashed. The crowd, numbering in the thousands, pressed close, their anticipation a palpable force as the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, prepared for his task. Sanson, who had operated the guillotine through the darkest months of the Terror, showed no hesitation. This was just another day's work, even if the condemned was the man who had once dictated the rhythm of death. Robespierre was the last of his group to be taken up the steps, forced to watch as his allies met their ends one by one. Saint Just, ever the idealist, faced the blade with a defiant calm, his head falling into the basket with a dull thud. Augustin and the others followed, their executions swift and mechanical, the crowd's cheers growing louder with each drop of the blade. When Robespierre's turn came, the atmosphere reached a fever pitch. Soldiers half carried him up the scaffold, his body trembling from pain and exhaustion. As he was strapped to the bascule, the tilting board that would position him beneath the blade, a final act of cruelty unfolded. The executioner, whether out of malice or necessity, tore away the bandage covering Robespierre's wounded jaw to ensure a clean cut. The action elicited a guttural scream of agony from the broken man, a sound so raw and piercing that it momentarily silenced the jeering crowd. Blood poured anew from the reopened wound, staining his chest as his head was forced into place. Witnesses later recounted the horror of that moment, the once invincible leader reduced to a pitiable, suffering figure, his cries echoing across the square. There was no dignity in this death, no noble last stand. It was a brutal, messy end, as merciless as the thousands he had ordered during his reign. The executioner released the blade, and with a sickening rush, the guillotine did its work. Robespierre's head fell, severed cleanly despite the gore, and rolled into the basket below, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the fate he had engineered for so many others. Sanson, as was custom, lifted the head by its hair, displaying it to the crowd, who erupted in a deafening roar of triumph and relief. "The tyrant is dead," they shouted, their voices a cathartic release of months, even years, of pent-up terror. Blood dripped onto the scaffold, mingling with the stains of countless others, as Robespierre's body was unceremoniously removed and carted away. The man who had dreamed of a virtuous republic, who had wielded terror as a tool of justice, was gone, his life extinguished by the very instrument he had made synonymous with revolution. The Place de la Révolution, for so long a stage of horror, bore witness to the end of the reign of terror's most powerful figure, a death as dramatic and gruesome as the era he defined. But the story does not end with the fall of the blade. The execution of Robespierre marked a turning point for France, a moment when the revolution began to recoil from its own excesses. In the next part, we will explore the immediate aftermath of his death, the fate of his allies and enemies, and the lasting legacy of a man whose name remains synonymous with both idealism and tyranny. How did Paris and the world react to the end of the incorruptible, and what scars did his reign leave on history? The sun had barely set on the 28th of July, 1794, 10 Thermidor, in the revolutionary calendar, when the news of Maximilien Robespierre's execution spread like wildfire through the streets of Paris. The man who had orchestrated the deaths of thousands, who had ruled through fear and an unyielding vision of virtue, was gone, his head severed by the very guillotine he had championed as an instrument of justice. In the Place de la Révolution, the crowd dispersed slowly, their cheers of triumph giving way to a strange, uneasy quiet. For many, the death of the incorruptible was a moment of catharsis, a release from the suffocating terror that had gripped France for over a year. But for others, it was a harbinger of uncertainty. With Robespierre gone, who would steer the revolution now? The blood-stained scaffold stood as a grim reminder that the violence he had unleashed could not be so easily erased, even with his demise. In the immediate aftermath, the National Convention moved swiftly to dismantle the machinery of the Reign of Terror. The men who had orchestrated Robespierre's fall, Joseph Fouché, Jean-Lambert Tallien, and Paul Barras among them, seized control, eager to distance themselves from the excesses of the past while consolidating their own power. The Committee of Public Safety, once the epicenter of Robespierre's authority, was stripped of its dictatorial powers, and the law of 22 Prairial, which had enabled mass executions without trial, was repealed. The Revolutionary Tribunal, though not abolished immediately, saw its scope drastically reduced, and the pace of executions slowed to a trickle. Prisons, overflowing with those accused of vague crimes against the Republic, began to empty as thousands were released, their lives spared by the sudden shift in political winds. This period, known as the Thermidorian reaction, marked a deliberate turn away from radicalism, as the convention sought stability over ideological purity. Yet the men who replaced Robespierre were hardly saints. Many, like Fouché, had blood on their hands from the terror's darkest days, and their newfound moderation was often a mask for opportunism. The fate of Robespierre's allies and enemies painted a complex picture of retribution and survival. Those who had been arrested with him, including Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just and Augustin Robespierre, were already dead, their bodies buried in a common grave at the Arences cemetery alongside other victims of the guillotine. The Paris Commune, which had briefly rallied to Robespierre's cause on the night of 9 Thermidor, was purged of his supporters, with dozens executed or imprisoned in the days that followed. On the other side, Robespierre's adversaries rose to prominence, though their unity was short-lived. Tallien and Barras became key figures in the new regime, while Fouché, ever the survivor, maneuvered behind the scenes, later serving under Napoleon with the same ruthless cunning he had shown in 1794. The revolution, once driven by ideals of equality and fraternity, was now in the hands of pragmatists and profiteers, a bitter irony for a man who had dreamed of a virtuous republic. The radical Jacobin Club, Robespierre's political base, was suppressed, its influence waning as France groped toward a more conservative future under the Directory, a government established in 1795. Robespierre's personal legacy was buried as unceremoniously as his body. His name became a byword for tyranny, a cautionary tale of idealism corrupted by power. The French people, exhausted by years of upheaval, sought to forget the terror, and with it, the man who had come to embody its horrors. His writings and speeches, once celebrated as the voice of the revolution, were vilified or ignored, and his image was erased from public spaces. Yet, history could not so easily erase the impact of his reign. The guillotine, though used less frequently after 1794, remained a symbol of revolutionary violence, a stark reminder of the cost of Robespierre's vision. Beyond France, his story reverberated through Europe, inspiring both fear and fascination among monarchs and reformers alike. To some, he was a monster, a bloodthirsty dictator who had betrayed the revolution's promise. To others, particularly later socialist thinkers, he was a tragic figure, a man whose commitment to equality was undone by the chaos of his time. The scars of the Reign of Terror lingered long after Robespierre's head fell. Families mourned loved ones lost to the blade. Communities struggled to rebuild trust, shattered by suspicion, and the very idea of revolution took on a darker hue. France would not fully recover from these wounds for decades, as subsequent regimes, Napoleon's empire, the restored monarchy, and beyond grappled with the question of how to balance liberty with order. Robespierre's dream of a republic founded on virtue had crumbled, but the questions he raised about justice, equality, and the price of change endured, echoing through centuries of political thought. Was he a visionary undone by circumstance, or a tyrant whose zeal justified unimaginable cruelty? History offers no easy answer, only the weight of his actions and the blood that stained his hands. As we close this tale of ambition and downfall, one cannot help but ponder the thin line between hero and villain, between the pursuit of a better world and the destruction it can wrought. Robespierre's life and death stand as a haunting mirror to our own times, a reminder that even the noblest ideals can lead to the darkest deeds when wielded without restraint. What do you think? Could the revolution have survived without the terror? Or was Robespierre's path an inevitable consequence of the chaos he sought to tame? I invite you to share your thoughts, to reflect on this brutal chapter of history, and to consider what lessons it holds for us today.